And frankly, pun intended, Dune by Frank Herbert and its 5 sequels hold an important place in the history of the science fiction genre. Amongst the best-selling books of all time, they are also some of the most universally praised science fiction books ever written. In fact, Arthur C. Clarke, one of the titans of classic sci-fi, called Herbert's works the Lord of the Rings of the science fiction genre. And I don't think it's hyperbole. This is some of the finest works of science fiction that I have read. So I just finished reading the series and I'd like to talk about it just a little bit. I'm going to give a ranking and a spoiler-free review of each of these books, the things I liked, the things I didn't like so well, and I hope that you do enjoy this video. Before I get started, please give me a like and subscribe and drop me a comment, especially if you've read these books. I'd really like to hear your take. Especially like to hear any Dune veterans that have read these books more than once. I've read the first book twice and I've read all of the sequels just once. So I consider myself kind of a newbie when it comes to the Dune universe. Although I'm a very seasoned reader, I'm not the most experienced Dune reader, so you may have different perspectives and I'd love to hear them in the comments below. One thing I will also do at the very end of this video is I'll address that elephant in the room as to whether I think that you should read Brian Herbert's contributions to the Dune universe. I'd like to start this video with 2 things that I find I love universally in all 6 of these books. This will cut down on some redundancy later. The first is the world building. I found the world building by Herbert probably the best of any science fiction works that I've read. In fact, for me to find his equals, I have to dip into the fantasy genre where world building is something that's a lot more prevalent, a lot more common. But what Herbert does in these books is present just a world and a universe that is so vividly portrayed. And I don't think I found its equal in the science fiction genre. But not just the world. You know, the Dune world of Arrakis, of course, is one of the most vividly portrayed worlds I've seen. But even beyond that, just in the universe, the things that he's done with the other worlds, describing the factions like the noble houses at the beginning of the saga, and then other things like the Fremen in the first book, the Bene Gesserit sisterhood who pervade all 6 novels. I just found that that aspect of Herbert's writing, frankly, doesn't have a peer in my mind from what I've read in the science fiction genre. So that's something that I universally love about all 6 of these books. The other thing that I really enjoy about Herbert's books is the deeper themes within the text. These are not always, and very rarely, straightforward science fiction tales. That's what I love most about this genre. It's not the setting in space or futuristic things. It's the deeper themes, the more thought-provoking themes that science fiction often portrays so well. And Herbert's books are just chock full of them. Some of the deeper themes pervade all of the books, like environmentalism and ecology, as well as just talking about humanity, but there are some much deeper themes within some of these books that I will talk about if I feel it's very important in regards to each book that I review. So let's go ahead and get started with my ranking. I'm going to start with my 6th favorite and go to my favorite so that this video will become progressively more positive as we go through. Because number 6, Heretics of Dune, I didn't like this one. And because I'm going to talk for several minutes about a book that I didn't like and give you a lot of negativity, I am going to put some timestamps below. So if you want to skip ahead to the other 5 books, because I did enjoy the other 5 books, but I did not enjoy Heretics of Dune. So I'm going to be a bit negative in this one. I also feel that if you're going to be critical about something, that you need to justify that criticism. So I can't just say, Heretics of Dune was a lousy book, let's go on to number 5. I want to tell you the reasons that I think that Herbert gave us a bad book in this case. So, Heretics of Dune, first of all, it's important to know the overarching architecture of the series. He wrote his initial trilogy, and then God Emperor of Dune is kind of a standalone, and then there's going to be a next trilogy. So he envisioned a 7-book series with 2 trilogies on either end. Unfortunately, he didn't finish the trilogy. But Heretics of Dune, being the 5th book, was to be the first book in this second trilogy. So I recognize that anytime an author has to write a new series, a trilogy, or longer book series, they have a lot to do. One of the things they have to do is they have to introduce you to a large cast of characters. They have to establish the setting. So in the case of a setting that's not familiar to anybody, that involves some world building. And then you have to weave it together in some sort of story, give some sort of plot that leads you from beginning to end in some sort of compelling manner. And frankly, pun intended, I think that Herbert only gave us one of the three successfully. Let's talk about character, because I think he did not do character very well. I will admit that as much as I enjoy these books and I enjoy Herbert's writing, character is not his strength. He is much better at different aspects of the story, notably world building and setting and theme that I mentioned at the very beginning. The reason that Herbert is not as good at this as some other authors is that his writing style in these books, he gives you a kind of an omniscient third-person point of view. So he's jumping from character to character quite frequently, often from paragraph to paragraph. So although that can work very well, I think it works very well in the first novel because you got the motivations of the characters pretty quickly, a lot of them. I think it detracted from this one. You don't get a lot of depth when you write from that point of view. So you get a great breadth, but not a lot of depth. And I felt that at the end of this book, I only knew like one or two of the characters, and everybody else seemed very, very superficial. That can be okay if you have a riveting plot, which you do not. But I'll talk about that last. Let me talk about setting and world building because Herbert does a great job here. You may wonder why Herbert has to devote a lot of the text to setting and world building when it's the fifth book of these chronicles. Well, there are some major time jumps. So from the end of the first trilogy to the beginning of the second trilogy, 5,000 years have passed. So there's a lot for Herbert to reveal what has gone on in those 5,000 years, from the ecology of the Dune planet Arrakis to all of the factions that we knew in the first trilogy, where they are, what their standing in the universe is now, and additionally new factions that have come along the way. So because of that, he has to devote a bit of time in just establishing this setting, and I think he's very successful in that regard. I had a very clear picture of the universe, what was going on Arrakis, off Arrakis, where all the factions were, who the new factions were. He was very successful in that regard, and that was probably the best aspect of Heretics of Dune. But leading to the last portion, plotting and pacing was a big problem for me in this book. To say that it was slow is an insult to slow books that are good. Because a lot of times if a book is slow, you get more. For instance, in this book, if it's slowly plotted, but I'm getting a lot of character depth, I usually don't mind it. In fact, I just started a book series by Robin Hobb where the book was like that. It was a slow-moving plot, but I was getting a lot of detail and insight into the characters, but I didn't get either of those in this book. And there's one other aspect of the plotting and pacing that was a huge disappointment. He was jumping around a lot because a lot of this happens off-world, off of the Dune planet. And because of that, it was hard to get some momentum going. And every single time that Herbert gave us a great chapter, he always followed up with something less interesting. Every single time in this book. So that was a huge disappointment because every time I thought, oh, it's starting to get good, he disappointed me. And then 600 pages into an almost 700-page book, the action picks up, it's starting to get really interesting. And Herbert skipped scenes. Scenes that would have been so much more interesting than the drivel he was giving us earlier in the book. So Heretics of Dune was a vast disappointment for me. I hate to be so negative to such a classic author, but I just don't feel that it was a very good book. But I enjoyed the other 5 books. So let's go to the next one. My 5th favorite was Chapter House Dune, which is the direct sequel to Heretics of Dune and the last one that Herbert completed before he passed away. Chapter House Dune, what I liked most about it is it was really the Bene Gesserit book of the series. Ever since the first book, I was fascinated by this Bene Gesserit sisterhood and just kept waiting for Herbert to continue to flesh out what it was like to be a Bene Gesserit, what they were all about. And he gave you a little bit throughout all of the books in the series, but this is the one where he finally gave us the depth that I'd been craving since that first book. About 80% of the book felt to me like it was narrated or from the point of view of one of the sisters. And because of that, I felt that even though he was jumping around point of view like he tends to do, I still felt that I was getting a thorough narrative throughout this about the Bene Gesserit sisterhood. So that made this one highly riveting, and I enjoyed this one. I read this one a lot faster than Heretics, even though they were about the same length. Additionally, the plot was good. I wouldn't say it was great. It wasn't quite as riveting as, say, the first 4 books in the series, but it had enough to keep you going. And the pacing, he did such a better job of this one. When he would jump to the secondary characters or the characters that were just not as important within this book's narrative, it was always short-lived. It was always short chapters, and it always got back to the main crux of what he was telling in this book. So I really enjoyed Chapter House Dune, and even though you can construe it ending with a cliffhanger, I didn't really see it that way, but even though the ending wasn't the best for some people, I thought it was a good ending to his contribution to the Dune world. All right, on to number 4. Number 4 in my ranking is Dune Messiah, which is the second book of Herbert's Dune books. I'll be honest, when I first read this, I was disappointed. But I think anybody who reads this book is going to be disappointed because you're following up the original, Dune, by Frank Herbert, arguably one of the best, if not the best book in the history of the science fiction genre. How can you not be let down by the sequel? However, since I've read that several months ago, I have to say of these 6 Dune books, this is the one that I think about the most. And I think about most specifically what Herbert was attempting to do with this book. The prevailing theme in this book is one of deconstruction, where Herbert is examining what you think you knew, finishing the first book, and kind of flipping it on its head, whether that's about the overarching story or what you think about some of these characters. And I'm sure that a lot of readers did not like that. That is a bit jarring when you finish a book and you think you know what you know, and then the author flips everything on its head and makes you think, oh, maybe this person isn't what I thought they are. I find the concept fascinating, and the more I think about it, the more I feel that he was successful in portraying this. To see a modern day version of this done poorly, go watch Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi. I think he was trying to do the same thing. He was trying to deconstruct everything that you thought you knew, but I thought he failed miserably in that book. But I think Herbert, in that movie, but I think Herbert was successful in Dune Messiah. There is one aspect of the story that I didn't like, though. In his deconstruction of Paul's character, he frankly just made him boring. And I realized that, you know, he's trying to pull you away from that character a little bit, but I felt that he could have done it in a different manner and not made him simply boring, because in the first book, every time Paul was on the page, it was riveting. And every time in this book he was on the page, I just wanted to go somewhere else in the story. So I think that was a little near miss narratively from Herbert. And I will say the ending of this one is definitely the most memorable of the 6 books. I really hope that Denis Villeneuve gets to make the third Dune book, the third Dune movie, which would be based on this book, because I want to see that final scene on the big screen, because it is grand and epic and just so memorable, and it would blow people's minds just to see it. So I really hope that we get that third movie by Villeneuve sometime. But Dune Messiah, after more contemplation, I was less disappointed and more intrigued by what Herbert did in the narrative. So my third favorite of all the Dune books is the third book in the series, Children of Dune. The reason I ranked this a little higher than Dune Messiah, I didn't find it as thought-provoking, but I found it a little bit more narratively compelling. I read this one very quickly because it hooked me early and just kept me going. And of course, the third book in a series is probably going to do that, because you have to wrap up the plot, where the second book is just kind of oftentimes setting up the third book. So I understand why I probably was more compelled to get to the end of this one. And I think it was a good conclusion to the original trilogy. The story didn't necessarily go where I wanted it to go or where I thought it would go, but it went to a good concluding place. And I think it's a very good trilogy that most people would enjoy. A couple aspects of this book I didn't enjoy that I do want to bring up. Probably the reason that I really liked this versus loved this book is the main protagonist. You find out partway through the book of these children of Dune. Got to say this without bringing up spoilers. Okay, the children of Dune are a set of twins. One boy and one girl, so I'm going to be very vague to not reveal gender, but one of the twins ends up being basically the main protagonist of this story. And I found, with the exception of when the twin was interacting with the other twin, I found the character entirely unlikable. So it's really hard to love a book where the main protagonist is someone that you simply don't like. And I never liked the character except for those scenes where the two twins were interacting with one another. So I think that was something that I didn't enjoy about Children of Dune. The other thing is, along with the lines of deconstruction that he's been doing in the last two books, he deconstructs a lot of characters, and I think he totally whiffed on one of the characters. There's a character that's with us from the first book up through this book, who in the first book I would probably describe as delightful. And he turns this character into this sniveling creature that is unrecognizable from what you had in the first book. I know why he did it, but I think this is just kind of a spotlight on the fact that Herbert was not great with character. Although I believe that this character would not fundamentally change over decades. I can't say more because of spoilers. I know characters can change over decades, but this character would not. But even if this character changes over the course of a couple decades, I think a less ham-handed approach might have worked. You know, I think a skilled hand like a Robert Jordan who can use a lot of finesse to show character growth, maybe it would have worked, but I just found it to be just sloppily done and frankly a betrayal of this character. So that was another aspect I didn't like with this book. But I think it wrapped up the initial trilogy very well. It is one that I will reread, and I did enjoy it overall. All right, on to my second favorite Dune book, and that is God, Emperor of Dune. So God, Emperor of Dune is the unique book in the series in that it is basically a standalone in the middle of these two trilogies that Herbert planned. I will say, out of God, Emperor of Dune, this is the one that I feel that I probably, as a first-time reader, did not grasp everything that was in this book. This was a highly philosophical book, a lot of density, a lot of thought-provoking ideas, a lot of thought-provoking themes. And I think this is the one that I most want to reread because I know that I didn't get everything. As an example, Herbert starts all of his chapters with an epigraph, which is, if you don't know that term, it's just kind of an introductory paragraph that's apart from the main chapter that is from another source and explains some of the things that may go on in that chapter. Some of these epigraphs were so chock full of grand ideas that you could read the epigraph and probably sit and have a lengthy philosophical discussion about that paragraph. And it happens so often in this text. I would read the epigraph and just shake my head and open my eyes and think, my goodness, that's making me think. And now I have to read the chapter after it. So God, Emperor of Dune was full of that. So because of that, it's the one I want to reread the most. But don't let me mislead you into thinking that this is just some dense philosophical book that's, too deep for science fiction or fiction in general. There was still a highly compelling narrative. In fact, this book started with one of the most memorable scenes in the entire Dune saga that Herbert wrote. Very, very memorable introduction to one of the characters. And I think Herbert, because he only focused on a few characters, because one of the big characters was the God Emperor, I think because of that, you got a lot more depth than maybe any of the other Dune books. But the big thing of this is the themes. It's a big meditation on humanity. The title itself, God, Emperor, there's a lot of ideas about God and religion and theology. What is a God? And Emperor, talking about government and civilization as a whole. And there's so much in there, and I can't wait to reread it and just try to get more. I may just reread the epigraphs to start. But God, Emperor of Dune was a smashing success in my mind and the second best book in the series. So number one, probably not a surprise for anybody, is Frank Herbert's original, Dune. I love this book. I already did a full review on this, so I'll just kind of be brief with my summation about what I think this is, why I think this is so great. The reason that I rank this the highest of all of the books is there's just something magical in this book that I feel the sequels lack. There's just something magical about that first step into this very rich and deep universe that Herbert gave us. The first time you're introduced to some of these characters, the first time you see Arrakis, the first time you meet the Fremen, the first time you meet the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood, there's just something magical about all of those introductions that I just don't feel that the sequels quite get. That isn't to say that they're bad. In my reading advice, I think that these are worth your time, and I have no regrets in reading all of these books. But there is something magical about that initial book, and the people that say that it is the greatest work of science fiction, I don't think they're that far off. It's still a top 3 work of science fiction in my mind, and the sequels are very worthy of the original. Now, I think at the beginning, if I remember, that was like, I don't know, a half hour ago. I think at the beginning when I started talking, I said I was going to give you some reading advice, and I was going to address the elephant in the room about Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson's contributions to the Dune universe. So let me start there. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Brian Herbert, Frank's son, got together with Kevin J. Anderson, the science fiction writer, and after Frank's death started contributing more books into the Dune universe. And I think they have 8 or 9 at this point. To say that they are decisive is a huge understatement. When you read people talking about these sequels, they either love them or hate them. The ones that love them seem to say that they like them more because they're not so deep with theme and they're more straightforward science fiction tales. Whereas the people that do not like these books say that they are basically really bad fan fiction. But it's not a 50-50 split. My very unscientific research into this topic, it seems to be 4-1 against versus 4. And it seems like the people that are against are definitely very outspoken about this, that go so far as to say that they want part of their life back the times that they read these books. So I was leaning towards originally just reading the 2 books that they wrote, Hunters of Dune and Sandworms of Dune, which are supposedly taken from notes for Frank's final novel. So I was going to read those, and then I saw the decisiveness of the Dune community. I was leaning towards not reading them. Then I read the synopsis of where the story was going, and I realized I didn't want to go there. The story that Hunters of Dune is supposed to portray is supposed to bring back all of these characters that have been long dead 5,000 years. And I read the synopsis, and I just thought, that sounds like a really bad idea. Especially a bad idea from somebody else writing these characters that's not Frank. But I will also say that some of this is on Frank because Chapter House Dune did not leave me with the feeling that, oh, I need to know where this story goes. What I loved about Chapter House Dune was learning more about the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood. It was not the plot that I thought was great about Chapter House Dune. And Chapter House ends in a manner that I can just kind of wonder. And I think that I kind of like having the open-ended ending to the saga that Frank left us with. So that's where I'm going to stop. My reading advice for these books, read Dune for sure. Everybody, anyone that sees this video, read Dune, it's fantastic. If you really like it, I would say then take a little break and then read Dune Messiah and Children of Dune back to back because they very much go together. Take a little break and then read God Emperor and stop there. I can't, in good conscience, recommend anybody read Heretics of Dune. And even though I read Chapter House Dune, I think unless you're a total completionist, I think you read the first 4 and leave the last 2 off. So that's my reading advice for the Dune universe, for what it's worth. So here's where you come in. If you've made it this far in the video, thanks for watching. But if you've made it this far and you've read Dune, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Whether you agree with what I say, whether you disagree. If you've read them all, I'd love to hear your rankings too, 1 through 6, just to see how they line up with mine. But I did enjoy these books, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. So please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Please follow me on Twitter and Goodreads. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.